Her son told her, in front of the whole church, that she needed a nursing home. Marilyn Tate, 72, didn't flinch. David, her only child, grinned and turned back to his coffee. Within weeks, the title to his prized black pickup would be in her name. And her name alone. She'd spent years as his ride when he needed one. Now she was driving her own future. And when he came demanding his keys, the law would answer for her. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The fellowship hall always had a certain stillness after Bible study ended, as if the room itself were exhaling. The last notes of chatter and the faint scent of brewed coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the sweetness of lemon bars cooling on a plastic tray. Overhead, the ceiling fan turned in a slow, lazy arc, pushing around air that had been warmed by an afternoon sun pressing through the high windows. Folding chairs squeaked against the worn linoleum as people stood, gathered their Bibles, and made small talk about dinner plans or errands yet to be run. Marilyn Tate took her time packing her well-worn leather Bible into her tote bag, the thin pages still faintly warm from being held. Her knees complained as she rose from the metal chair, and she leaned on her cane for a moment, letting the ache subside. 72 years had taught her that a graceful exit required patience, especially when half the congregation seemed determined to stand in the doorway, swapping weather forecasts. She noticed her son, David, on the far side of the room, standing in a relaxed posture that suggested he was ready to be somewhere else. He was laughing with Brother Harlan, the two of them comparing notes about last night's Braves game, their words punctuated by the clinking of coffee cups being stacked into a plastic tub. Marilyn stepped carefully between two folding tables, feeling the familiar stiffness in her right hip. She waited for a pause in their conversation before speaking, her voice gentle but clear enough to carry. "David," she said, "would you mind giving me a ride home?" It was not an unusual request. Her own car sat in the driveway at home, perfectly fine for short errands to the grocery store or the post office, but she had never been fond of driving at dusk, and the Baptist church was a good 15 minutes across town. She expected he would agree as he usually did, perhaps with a sigh or a glance at his watch. Instead, without even fully turning toward her, David said, "Mom doesn't need a ride. She needs a nursing home." The words landed with the weight of something casually cruel, the sort of remark made without thought, but capable of drawing blood all the same. The sound in the room shifted. Conversations faltered. A few people froze mid-step. Somewhere near the coffee urn, an uncomfortable laugh escaped, brittle and quick. Another chuckle followed from a man stacking hymnals, though it died in his throat when he caught Marilyn's eye. Across the room, Evelyn Cross stopped in her tracks. The crisp bulletin she had been folding bent sharply in her hands. Her expression hardened into a glare that could have withered ivy. Evelyn was a woman who believed in hospitality but not at the expense of dignity, and she stared at David with the unblinking intensity of a hawk locking onto its prey. Marilyn did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Her face held the same faint, practiced smile she had used to navigate years of school board politics and the occasional ill-mannered parent in the library. Inside, however, her pulse was steady in that way it became when she decided to remember something. Not just remember, but file it away for use later. She simply inclined her head, murmured, "Well," and let the rest of the sentence fade into the soft rustle of people collecting coats. David had already turned back to Brother Harlan, speaking as if nothing had happened. The moment dissolved for everyone except Marilyn, who felt its outline growing sharper in her mind. The fellowship hall's cheerful bustle returned, though now it carried a faint stiffness, a polite avoidance of eye contact in her direction. Someone began stacking the remaining lemon bars into a plastic container, avoiding her side of the table altogether. Evelyn drifted toward her, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum. She leaned close, her voice pitched low enough to keep it between them. "Don't you let that slide," she said, each word weighted and deliberate. "I won't," Marilyn replied, still wearing that polite, impenetrable smile. They walked together toward the glass doors at the front, where sunlight poured in thick and golden, outlining dust motes that hung suspended in the air. The heavy door gave a muted thud as Evelyn pushed it open, letting in the late summer heat and the drone of cicadas from the pine trees beyond the parking lot. David's black pickup truck gleamed in the nearest space, the chrome flashing as it caught the sun. It was a newer model. Polished, meticulously maintained, the sort of vehicle he liked to mention came with all the bells and whistles. The Savannah light seemed to rest on it like a spotlight. Marilyn paused for a fraction of a second, her eyes lingering on the truck before she stepped aside to let Evelyn pass. From behind her, she heard David laugh again, the sound careless and entirely unaware of the small, precise shift that had just taken place in her thoughts. She adjusted her grip on the cane, tucked the lemon bar more securely into her bag, and stepped out into the warmth. Somewhere in the space between the sting of his words and the sight of that gleaming truck, an idea began to take shape, cool, clean, and entirely her own. By the time she reached the curb, it had taken root. The moment to act presented itself as plainly as a hymn number on the board. David drifted toward the far end of the hall, intercepted by one of the deacons asking about a leaking gutter. He lifted his hands in that performative, helpful way he had, nodding, explaining, already absorbed. The keys hung from his belt like a boast. Polished fob, tiny brass house key, a novelty bottle opener shaped like a fish. Marilyn moved with the steady, unhurried grace of someone returning a cup to the kitchen, nothing furtive or fast, only deliberate. She reached to pat his arm in passing, an affectionate mother's gesture, smooth as a breath, and when her fingers left his sleeve, the keys weren't where they'd been. They were in her palm, surprisingly warm from his body heat. Marilyn didn't tuck them away right away. She let them rest under the folded church bulletin she had carried all evening, the slick paper making a whisper as it bent. The gathered talk rose again behind her. Chairs scraped, someone laughed too loudly, a chorus of "good nights" floated toward the door. She offered a few of her own, pausing once to straighten a crooked stack of devotionals on the credenza out of sheer habit. Her heart did not race. It moved with the same even cadence it always did when she had settled on a course and found it sensible. Evelyn caught her eye from across the hall, one eyebrow lifted in question. Marilyn tipped the corner of the bulletin just enough for the metal to glint. Evelyn's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more like the flash of teeth when a fox knows exactly where the henhouse gate sits. Outside, the heat folded around her like pressed linen. The sky held that bruised lavender of late summer evening, and the cicadas sang as if they had been paid for it. Asphalt radiated the day's stored warmth through the soles of her shoes. The church parking lot was a shallow bowl of red taillights and polite waves, couples easing sedans into gear, the pastor's minivan idling near the curb. David's pickup nearest to the door waited with a kind of muscular patience, dark paint reflecting the pinking clouds. Marilyn did not look back to see if David glanced around, did not strain to hear the call of "Mom" that never came. She opened her tote, slid the bulletin and the keys deep inside, and crossed the few yards as if she had always meant to. No hesitation. No fumble. The fob chirped in her hand. The truck answered with a soft blink of lights and a courteous unlock. She liked that, how it acknowledged her presence without pretending it had a choice. The step up into the cab was taller than her sedans, but the running board gave good purchase, and she set her cane against the door sill and lifted herself with slow, practiced leverage. The interior smelled faintly of new leather and someone's pocket cologne, with an undertone of rubber mats and clean air vents. She pulled the door closed, sealing herself into a quiet cocoon where the outside world receded into a muted hum. She sat for a moment, letting her body adjust to the seat's firm support. The dashboard glowed a soft blue, the kind light that meant to be helpful rather than bossy. She found the lever under the seat and eased herself forward an inch, then another, until her knee could press the brake without complaint. Mirrors came next, one to catch the sweep of the lot behind, one to gather the lane lines that would take her home. Each small adjustment felt like lining up a picture frame. Tilt a degree, step back, nod. Her reflection in the rear view was composed, the lines at the corners of her eyes deeper than they had been 10 years ago, but underwritten by something bright and steady. A tap sounded on the passenger window. Evelyn, framed by evening and grinning in a way that would have scandalized anyone who didn't know her, pantomimed a question with her hands. "You good?" Marilyn rolled the window down an inch. "I'll be right behind you," Evelyn said. "If he asks me anything, I'll pretend I was never here." "That would be a first," Marilyn said, and the two women shared a look that passed a warm current between them. The engine turned over on the first twist, so quiet for such a big machine that it felt like a secret between them. She eased the truck into reverse, the backup camera painting a tidy picture of the world she was leaving. The tires rolled over a scattering of pecan shells near the curb with a muted crunch. At the exit of the lot, she paused to let the pastor's van go, then signaled right with the kind of courtesy that had never left her. The truck moved like a horse that had been well broken, responsive, dignified, eager to please. Savannah eased past in vignettes, porches strung with ferns, chain-link fences guarded by small brown dogs, a boy on a bicycle chasing his own shadow down a narrowing ribbon of sidewalk. The live oaks along Whitaker threw long, reachy arms across the road, their leaves mottling the last sun into 1,000 copper coins. Marilyn kept a steady 15 over the bridges and a sensible 10 down the neighborhood streets, attentive to each stop sign, one hand at 10 o'clock on the wheel, the other resting lightly near the shifter. She did not hurry. She did not dawdle. She drove. Evelyn's headlights stayed 2 car lengths behind, a quiet escort. At a red light, Marilyn glanced at the passenger seat and imagined the times David had insisted she was slipping, the rehearsed concern that always sounded like a verdict. The light turned green. The truck obeyed her foot without complaint, the transmission whisper smooth. She found herself smiling, not the tight social smile she had worn earlier, but the private one she saved for when something fit. By the time she turned onto her street, the sky had gone the color of a bruised peach, and cricket song had replaced the cicadas. Her tidy ranch waited with the porch light she'd set on a timer, 2 pots of geraniums framing the steps. She pulled into the driveway with a graceful arc that would have pleased her late husband. Straight, centered, no correction needed. The engine ticked as it cooled, a series of fading heartbeats. Evelyn rolled to a stop at the curb and lowered her window. "Well?" she asked, chin tipping toward the truck like a toast. Marilyn clicked the fob, listened to the locks settle, and hung the keys on the little wooden hook just inside her front door, the one engraved with TATE in small block letters. She looked back at the darkening street, then at the black truck in her drive, so calm it might have grown there. "He'll think he misplaced them," she said, voice soft but certain. "For tonight." Evelyn's grin sharpened. "And tomorrow?" Marilyn's eyes slid to the neat stack of mail on her entry table and the blank notepad beside the phone. "Tomorrow," she said, "I make a few calls." The next morning broke with the soft light of a Savannah summer, pale gold filtering through the lace curtains, the air already holding a trace of heat. Marilyn's kitchen smelled faintly of toast and percolating coffee, a comfort she had built her mornings on for decades. She had just set her mug down when a knock came at the side door. 2 measured raps, a pause, then another. Evelyn's head appeared first, framed by the screen door. "You've got company," she said, eyes flicking toward the driveway. "Ray Holloway's out front. Looks like he dressed for business." Sure enough, through the narrow front window, Marilyn could see Ray's silver sedan angled neatly against the curb. The man himself, tall, trim for 68, and wearing a pressed button-down despite the creeping humidity, stood at the edge of her lawn, hands in his pockets, surveying the black pickup as though it had arrived by divine appointment. Marilyn met him on the porch, cane tapping softly against the wood. "Ray," she said, "if you've come to recruit me for another church committee, I'm afraid my calendar's already too full." He chuckled, the sound warm but laced with curiosity. "Nothing like that. Just figured I'd check in. Evelyn tells me you had an interesting evening." His gaze slid toward the truck, then back to her. "Thinking about a little more independence, are you?" Marilyn followed his eyes to the vehicle, its paint gleaming under the late morning sun. "Oh, I don't know," she said lightly. "Might keep it. Feels a shame to let something so comfortable go to waste." Evelyn, who had planted herself against the porch rail with a satisfied tilt of her head, broke into a grin. "Poetic justice, if you ask me. You've been driving him around in your own way for years. Now you're just doing it with horsepower." Marilyn gave a soft laugh, but her hand lingered on the porch post as she considered her words. "I'll admit it handles better than I thought. Smooth. Quiet. Almost makes you forget who it belongs to." Ray's expression didn't shift much, but there was a flicker in his eyes. An assessment, quick and practiced. "Ownership," he said, "is 9/10 of the law, and paperwork is the other 10th. Marilyn turned that over in her mind, the way she might have once tested the weight of a rare library volume before shelving it. "Paperwork, huh?" "Mm-hmm." Ray rocked back on his heels. People make a big fuss about possession, but without the right signature on the right line, all you've got is an argument waiting to happen. Now, if someone were inclined, they could make sure those lines said exactly what they wanted. Evelyn's eyes danced between them like a spectator watching a match pick up speed. "Sounds like you're talking shop, Ray." "Just speaking in general terms," Ray replied, though the way he glanced at Marilyn said otherwise. "But I know a thing or two about titles, and I've seen situations where, let's just say, the paper didn't match the assumptions." Marilyn let a slow smile form, not hurried, not obvious. She felt the warm Savannah air pressing against the back of her neck, the faint scent of her own hydrangeas drifting up from the yard. "Well," she said, "it's always good to be informed." Ray tipped his head in a slight nod, as though a silent agreement had passed between them. He didn't linger, just stepped off the porch and crossed to his sedan with a lawyer's measured pace. The car eased away from the curb, leaving the truck glinting in its place like an unspoken dare. Evelyn leaned in, lowering her voice. "You're thinking about it." "I'm thinking," Marilyn said, "that some doors only open once." She looked down at her cane, then back at the truck, its chrome trim throwing tiny points of light into the summer air. The thought that followed was quieter, but it settled into her chest with the solidity of something inevitable. "And I've already got the keys." The next Tuesday afternoon found Marilyn and Evelyn sitting side by side at Evelyn's kitchen table, the one that looked out over her tidy backyard, where wind chimes tinkled lazily in the shade. A pitcher of sweet tea sweated between them, sending small rivers down the glass onto the coaster, and Evelyn's laptop sat open, its glow casting a pale light over the floral oilcloth. Marilyn adjusted her reading glasses and peered at the search bar as Evelyn typed with 2 deliberate fingers. "You're sure this is public information?" she asked, her tone not skeptical but cautious, like a librarian confirming a citation before printing a label. "Sweetheart," Evelyn said, "you'd be amazed at what people leave sitting right out in the open." She pressed enter, and the county lien records loaded in neat, impersonal rows. Property, vehicles, you name it. All you need is the right name and a bit of patience. It didn't take long. There he was, David Tate, listed with a single active lien on a late-model black pickup truck. Marilyn traced the words with her eyes, the name of the bank jumping out at her as plainly as if it had been written in red ink. "Well, I'll be," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a fisherwoman reeling in a stubborn catch. "Suncoast Bank. Not a small one, but not so big you can't get a real person on the phone." Marilyn leaned back, letting the information settle in her mind like the first clue in a mystery novel. "And this tells us?" "That he doesn't own that truck, free and clear," Evelyn said, "and that, my friend, is an opportunity." Later that afternoon, Ray's silver sedan pulled into Marilyn's driveway again, this time at her request. They settled into her sunlit den, Ray in the armchair, Evelyn on the sofa with her iced tea, Marilyn in her familiar spot near the window where she could see the truck in the drive. She handed him the printout Evelyn had made. Ray studied it for all of 30 seconds before nodding. "A lien like this means the bank technically owns the truck until the loan is paid in full. If someone," he glanced up, eyes glinting, "were to pay off the balance, the bank would release the title to the payer." Marilyn lifted her brows, the way she used to when students skirted too close to a library rule. "Legal?" "Absolutely," Ray said, his voice calm but carrying that little edge lawyers saved for when they were certain. "Banks don't care who pays it off, as long as they get their money. The moment the balance hits zero, the lien's lifted and they issue a clean title. Whoever's name is on the paperwork owns the vehicle. No gray area. She let the words turn slowly in her head. Money in, title out. It was that simple. Yet it wasn't. There was the cost. There was the question of whether it was worth making something so final. Her mind wandered to the sound of David's voice in the fellowship hall, the easy way he had announced her supposed need for a nursing home, as though he were doing her a kindness. She thought of the way the truck had purred under her hands the night she drove it home, smooth as if it had been waiting for her. "What's the number?" she asked at last. Ray folded his hands. "I can call the bank and find out the payoff amount. It's not pocket change, but you'd be surprised how often people do it for less noble reasons than yours." Evelyn leaned forward, eyes bright. "You've got the savings," she said, her voice steady. "And you've got the motive. Not many people get both in the same lifetime." Marilyn looked down at her lap, fingers absently smoothing the crease in her skirt. The truth was, she did have the savings, money she had put aside over years of steady work, careful planning, and the quiet discipline David had never bothered to learn. She had earmarked it for later, a vague horizon that kept moving as the years did. She glanced out the window, past the porch rail to the black truck in her driveway. Sunlight spilled across the hood, catching in the chrome until it looked almost white-hot. Ray broke the silence. "Do you want me to make the call?" Marilyn took a slow breath, the kind that fills the chest without showing on the outside. "Yes," she said finally, her gaze fixed on the truck. "Let's find out exactly what it would take." Evelyn smiled. Not the grin of mischief she wore for small victories, but the slower, deeper one reserved for moments when a plan began to breathe on its own. And Marilyn, still watching the sunlight slide along the truck's hood, thought, "If this is the price of principle, I can afford it." 2 days later, Marilyn stepped into the cool, citrus-scented air of Suncoast Bank's downtown branch, her cane clicking softly against the polished tile. The lobby was all clean lines and quiet efficiency, pale walls, brushed steel fixtures, and framed photographs of Savannah landmarks that looked just a little too perfect to be real. She felt Evelyn at her shoulder, a steadying presence in a sunflower yellow blouse that made her easy to spot in the sea of beige business casual. Ray was already there, standing near the reception desk with a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. He greeted her with the professional calm of a man who knew every step they were about to take. "Morning, Marilyn. You ready?" "As I'll ever be," she said, adjusting her grip on her cane. The loan officer, a young man with neatly parted hair and an expression that could have been carved from politeness itself, ushered them into a small conference room. Through the glass wall, Marilyn could see the ebb and flow of customers outside, people making deposits, cashing checks, living the quiet, ordinary moments of a weekday morning. Once they were seated, Ray placed the lien record printout on the table and spoke in that measured cadence that lawyers use when they want no room for misunderstanding. "My client wishes to satisfy the outstanding loan on this vehicle in full today. We'll need the title reissued immediately upon clearance of funds." The officer glanced at Marilyn, his expression warming slightly as if to acknowledge the unusual nature of the request. "You understand this will transfer full ownership rights to you?" "I do," she said, her voice steady. "And you're prepared to pay the payoff balance in one transaction?" She reached into her handbag and slid a cashier's check across the table. The thick paper whispered against the wood, the numbers neatly printed in black ink, a sum that would have made David's eyes widen. The officer studied it for a moment before nodding and tapping at his keyboard. "All right. Once we process this, the lien will be lifted, and the Department of Motor Vehicles will issue a clean title in your name. You'll receive the documents by mail, but I can print confirmation for you today." The clicking of his keys filled the small space. Marilyn's gaze drifted to the window, where a sliver of the street outside was visible between blinds. She could almost see the truck in her mind, parked right where she'd left it, as if waiting for this moment. Ray leaned back slightly, crossing one ankle over the other. "Ownership is about certainty," he said quietly, just for her. "This removes any doubt." It was done faster than she expected. The officer printed a temporary title document, the bank's embossed seal catching the light. When Marilyn's eyes landed on her own name, clear, precise in the space where his had been, something settled in her chest. Not joy, exactly, not triumph, just a quiet, resonant rightness. Ray gathered the papers into his portfolio, handling them with the care of something fragile but unassailable. "I'll file this with the DMV first thing. You'll have the permanent title within a week." Evelyn grinned across the table, the satisfaction in her expression impossible to miss. "I'll handle the celebration." They stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of the summer heat pressing down on the sidewalk. True to her word, Evelyn led them 2 blocks over to a narrow storefront that smelled of cinnamon and peaches before the door had even closed behind them. The bakery's glass case gleamed with rows of cobblers under latticed crusts, each one glistening like it had been brushed with gold. Evelyn ordered 3 generous slices of peach cobbler and insisted they eat them there at a small round table by the window. Marilyn took her first bite slowly, the buttery crust giving way to warm fruit, the sweetness lingering just long enough to remind her that some indulgences are worth their cost. Ray checked his watch, excused himself, and left with the document secure under his arm. Evelyn dabbed the corner of her mouth with a paper napkin, then leaned in. "So," she said, voice low, "how does it feel?" Marilyn set down her fork, glancing out the window toward the direction of home. "Like a door closed behind me," she said, "and I've got the only key." The letter reached David on a Wednesday morning. He was halfway through his second cup of coffee when he tore it open, expecting another payment reminder or a bank promotion. Instead, the words swam into focus with a meaning that hit like cold water: loan satisfied in full, lien released, title reissued to Marilyn E. Tate. For a moment he thought it was a mistake, a clerical glitch, maybe the wrong Tate, but the VIN number printed halfway down the page matched exactly. His pickup, his name nowhere to be found in the owner field. He called the bank before he'd even finished reading. A young woman with a pleasant, too even tone confirmed the file. Yes, the loan had been paid in full. No, there was no error. The payoff had been processed in person, funds cleared, ownership transferred. "To my mother?" David asked, his voice tight. "That's what the record shows," she replied. "The title has been reissued accordingly. You'll need to speak with the new owner about—" He hung up before she could finish. By the time he turned onto Maryland Street, his hands gripped the wheel hard enough to blanch his knuckles. The late morning sun glared off the hood, and the humid air coming through the half-cracked window felt heavier than it should. Sharon sat in the passenger seat, her lips pressed in a line sharp enough to cut. She had been silent for the last 10 minutes, which was somehow worse than anything she could have said. Marilyn's ranch came into view, white siding freshly washed by last week's rain, porch geraniums in full bloom, and there, in the driveway, the black pickup sitting as if it had always belonged. He pulled in behind it so fast the tires spat gravel. Sharon stayed put, sunglasses on, one hand clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. Marilyn was already on the porch, as if she'd known he would come. She stood with her cane in one hand and a sweating pitcher of sweet tea in the other, the kind with lemon slices floating like gold coins just below the surface. "Morning, David," she said evenly, her voice carrying no more urgency than if she were greeting the mailman. "It's warm today. Would you like a glass?" The offer landed with the dissonance of a hymn sung off-key. He strode up the porch steps, stopping just short of her rocking chair. "Why?" he asked, his tone brittle. "Is the title to my truck in your name?" She glanced toward the driveway as if considering the truck afresh. "Because that's where it belongs now." She poured tea into a tall glass, the liquid catching the sunlight before she set it on the small wicker table between them. Behind him, the sound of Sharon shifting in her seat reached the porch. Marilyn's eyes flicked past his shoulder, taking in the stiff silhouette in the car before returning to him. "You're welcome to sit," she said, nodding toward the empty rocker beside hers. He didn't move. The cicadas droned somewhere high in the pines. From the curb, the truck's polished chrome winked like it was in on the joke. David's jaw worked as if searching for words that would come out clean. When they didn't, he pointed toward the driveway. "This isn't over." Marilyn's fingers curled loosely around the handle of the pitcher. "No," she said, her tone soft but certain. "I suppose it's not." From the street, Sharon lowered her sunglasses, watching the two of them as if she were trying to gauge just how far this could go. The air between porch and curb felt weighted, a suspended breath before the drop. Marilyn reached for the second glass on the tray, poured herself tea, and took a slow sip, eyes never leaving her son's. "Would you like to know," she asked, "what I'm planning next?" David didn't sit. He stood there on the porch, one hand on the railing, the other gesturing toward the driveway as if pointing at the truck might undo the words she had just spoken. "You can't just take it," he said, his voice pitched low but hot. "That's theft." Marilyn lifted her glass, ice cubes clinking. "It's not theft if you own it." She took a slow sip, then set the glass back down, letting the condensation make a small wet ring on the wicker table. "And I do. The bank says so. The title says so. It's mine." His face reddened, the heat crawling up his neck. "I could take you to court." "You could," she said evenly, "but you'd lose." He opened his mouth, but the sharp crunch of tires on gravel cut through the humid air. Ray's silver sedan eased to a stop at the curb. He stepped out, leather portfolio in hand, and walked up the drive with the unhurried confidence of a man arriving exactly where he needed to be. "Morning," Ray said, climbing the steps. Without looking at David, he slid a sheet of paper from the portfolio and handed it to Marilyn. "Thought you might want an extra copy of the title, just in case." David snatched it before she could take it, scanning the single sheet as if sheer willpower could make the letters rearrange themselves. His jaw tightened when he reached the part listing owner, Marilyn E. Tate. Sharon had rolled down the passenger window, her voice carrying sharp across the yard. "This is a family betrayal," she said, each word bitten off clean. Marilyn glanced toward the car. "Family," she said, "shouldn't come with strings attached." David stepped down off the porch, as if distance might give him better footing. "You don't get it. That truck was—" The rumble of another engine joined the scene, this one familiar. Evelyn's blue sedan pulled in behind Ray's car, blocking part of the street. She got out, sunglasses in place, a small paper bag from the bakery dangling from her wrist. "Well," Evelyn said, surveying the tableau, "looks like I got here just in time." She came up the walkway, offering Marilyn the bag. "Peach hand pies. Figured you might need reinforcements." Marilyn accepted them with a small smile. Perfect timing. David looked between them. Ray with his papers, Evelyn with her calm, unflinching presence. And something in his stance shifted. His shoulders tightened, chin pulling back. The weight of being outnumbered pressed against him in a way words never could. "I'm not done with this," he said finally, heading for the car. The door slammed and the tires spat a small spray of gravel as he pulled away from the curb. Sharon didn't look back. The sound of the truck's keys jangling in Marilyn's pocket was almost imperceptible under the cicadas, but she heard it, felt it. Evelyn handed her a napkin from the bakery bag. "Well," she said, unwrapping a hand pie for herself, "what's next?" Marilyn looked down the empty street where David's car had vanished, then back to the black pickup in her driveway. "Next?" she said, her voice low but sure. "We make it worth keeping." By Friday morning, the air in Savannah was heavy enough to curl the edges of the porch flags. Marilyn stood at her kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the black truck catch the sunlight like a polished stone. She had no doubt David was somewhere pacing, replaying their conversation, and that thought brought a calm steadiness to her pulse. But keeping the truck wasn't the only option. That afternoon, she called Troy Benson, the owner of Benson's Auto, the same shop her late husband had trusted for 30 years. His voice was just as she remembered, gravelly from years of cigarettes, warm with the kind of familiarity that could only come from knowing the story behind every dent and oil change. "Sure, Marilyn," Troy said. "Bring it by and I'll give you a number. No pressure." Evelyn insisted on coming along. "I'm not letting you wander into a garage alone," she said, sliding into the passenger seat of the truck like she'd been riding shotgun in it for years. "Besides, I want to see Troy's face when he realizes whose name is on that title now." The shop smelled of motor oil, warm rubber, and faintly of the fried shrimp from the diner 2 doors down. Troy emerged from the back bay wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes scanning the truck before they even got out. "Well, I'll be," he said, circling the front. "This thing's practically showroom. Only thing shinier is you, Marilyn." She smiled. "Just give me the truth, Troy." He walked around it twice, popped the hood, and ran a practiced hand along the fender. After a few minutes, he named a price, fair, maybe even generous, but Marilyn only nodded, storing the figure away. Evelyn leaned close, her voice low. "With that kind of money, you could trade for something smaller, something you'd actually drive every day without feeling like you're hauling half the town behind you." Troy glanced between them. "Got a couple SUVs out back, light handling, good mileage, still enough room for groceries and church potlucks." They followed him to the rear lot where a compact pearl gray SUV sat under the shade of an oak. The lines were clean, the stance easy, like a car that didn't feel the need to prove itself. "Try her," Troy said, dangling the keys. Marilyn settled into the driver's seat. The interior smelled faintly of fabric freshener and new tires. Her hands fit easily on the wheel, and when she pressed the start button, the quiet hum felt almost polite compared to the truck's low growl. She eased it onto the side street, the steering smooth, the brakes responsive without that abrupt bite she disliked. "You look comfortable," Evelyn said from the passenger seat, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. Marilyn guided it around the block, feeling the way it took corners without leaning, how the ride smoothed over every bump in the pavement. It was the difference between wearing a perfectly tailored jacket and a coat borrowed from someone bigger. It fit without adjustment. Back at the shop, she sat for a moment before cutting the engine. "It feels right," she said quietly. Troy smiled, leaning in the open window. "We can make the trade today. You'll drive her home this afternoon." Evelyn tilted her head. "Or, you could keep the truck just a little longer. Drive David crazy wondering what you'll do with it." Marilyn didn't answer right away. She looked across the lot at the black pickup gleaming under the late-day sun, then back at the SUV's soft interior, her reflection calm in the glass. When she spoke, her voice carried the same steady weight it had on the porch. "Do the paperwork, Troy. Let's make it mine." Evelyn grinned, already imagining David's face. "Oh, he's not going to like this one bit." Marilyn just smiled, watching the SUV's keys land in her palm. The metal was warm from Troy's hand, but it was the promise in their weight that made her close her fingers around them and not let go. The grocery store parking lot shimmered in the heat, the blacktop breathing waves into the late afternoon air. Marilyn had just loaded the last of her paper bags into the pearl gray SUV when she heard the familiar slam of a car door behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was David. "Where's my truck?" he demanded, the words clipped, carrying across the rows of cars. His shadow fell beside hers on the pavement. Marilyn straightened slowly, closing the hatch with a gentle press. "It was never yours, David," she said, her voice calm enough to make the sentence sound like a fact from a history book. His mouth opened then shut, as if he couldn't decide whether to shout or reason. "You traded it, just like that?" "I replaced it," she said, locking the SUV with a quiet chirp, "with something that fits my needs." She slid her cane into her left hand, grocery receipt into her right, and started toward the cart return. A metallic blue sedan idled 2 rows over, Evelyn's. She sat behind the wheel, sunglasses shielding her eyes, but Marilyn could feel her watching. Not intervening, not yet, but close enough if she was needed. "You had no right," David said, following her to the cart corral. "I had the title," she replied without turning. "That's all the right anyone needs." For a moment, the only sounds were the rattle of the cart's wheels and the hum of distant engines. Somewhere, a baby fussed. A gull cried overhead. David stepped in front of her. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" Marilyn's brow lifted slightly. "Not nearly as much as your comment in the fellowship hall did." Color rose in his face, but before he could reply, a faint buzz came from his pocket. He pulled out his phone, scanned the screen, and muttered something under his breath. Without a word, he turned and stalked back to his car, slamming the door hard enough to make the frame shake. The blue sedan rolled forward and stopped beside Marilyn's SUV. Evelyn leaned across the passenger seat. "Sharon just posted something online," she said, vague as a politician, something about when your own family turns on you. Half the congregation will have seen it before dinner. Marilyn slid into the driver's seat of her SUV, setting the groceries carefully in the back. Let them read. They'll make their own conclusions. Back at home, the phone rang before she'd even finished putting away the milk. Ray's voice came through, steady and unhurried. Saw the post. Thought I'd remind you. You're in the clear, legally and otherwise. No one can touch you on this. I know, Marilyn said, tucking a carton of eggs into the refrigerator, but that won't stop them from trying to make it a story. Stories fade, Ray said. Titles don't. When she hung up, Marilyn went to the front window. The SUV sat in the drive, its silver paint catching the light in a softer way than the truck ever had. In the distance, thunderheads were gathering, the air thick with the promise of a storm. She rested her hand on the windowsill, thinking of David's face in the parking lot, caught somewhere between disbelief and indignation, as if the laws of ownership should have bent themselves for him alone. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain toward the house. Marilyn smiled faintly. Some storms you waited out, others you invited in. The phone rang on a muggy Thursday evening, the kind where the air felt thick enough to drink. Marilyn had just set her supper plate in the sink when she recognized David's number on the caller ID. She let it ring twice, enough to make it clear she wasn't rushing, before lifting the receiver. Hello, David. His voice was clipped, the way it got when he'd rehearsed a request and wanted to get it out before losing his nerve. I need a loan. Just a couple $1,000. My car payment's due, and I'm short this month. Marilyn rested her hip against the counter. I see. She kept her tone mild, as if he'd asked about the weather. And why are you calling me? Because you can afford it, he said, irritation sharpening the words. I'll pay you back as soon as I can. No, she said simply. There was a pause long enough for her to hear the faint hum of his air conditioning on the line. No? No, she repeated. If you're short, you'll have to work it out some other way. Are you serious? After what you... He cut himself off, maybe realizing how that sentence would end. Fine, he snapped, and the line went dead. Marilyn replaced the receiver gently, her reflection in the dark kitchen window as calm as if she'd just turned down an invitation to lunch. The next morning, she relayed the call to Evelyn over coffee on the porch. Evelyn grinned like a woman savoring the first bite of pie. This, she said, is the best part. Watching them realize the gravy train's not coming back. 3 weeks later, the black SUV eased past a row of houses on the other side of town. Marilyn had no reason to be there except that she'd taken a wrong turn after leaving the farmer's market, and she didn't turn the wheel to correct it right away. She saw it before she saw him. A tow truck angled across David's driveway, a sedan hitched at the rear. A man in a neon vest was tightening the straps, while Sharon stood on the porch in yoga pants and an oversized t-shirt, arms folded tight, eyes darting toward the neighbors. David appeared in the doorway, phone pressed to his ear, his voice raised enough to carry even through the SUV's closed windows. He gestured toward the car, then toward the tow truck driver, as if volume might change the man's job description. Marilyn didn't slow, but her eyes took in every detail. The way Sharon kept her weight on one foot like she was trying to look casual. The way David's hair stuck up at the crown, unbrushed. By the time she reached the corner, the sedan's front wheels were already lifting off the driveway. A week later, Evelyn reported over the phone, "He's been using Sharon's car. She's not happy about it." The satisfaction in her voice was almost musical. Marilyn said nothing, only glanced out her own window where the SUV sat gleaming in the late-day light, perfectly at home in her driveway. 2 days after that, she happened to pass David's street again. This time, his driveway was empty except for Sharon's compact hatchback. He was in the yard dragging a garbage bin to the curb, the humid air plastering his shirt to his back. She drove by without tapping the brakes, her gaze fixed ahead, but she caught the quick flicker of recognition in his eyes. He watched her go. Marilyn kept her hands steady on the wheel, the hum of the engine smoothing the edges of her thoughts. There was no need to wave, no need to smile. Some messages were best delivered in silence. But as she turned the corner and the street disappeared behind her, a thought slipped in, sharp and deliberate. He hasn't even seen the rest of the plan yet. The morning sky over Savannah was the color of porcelain, soft and unbroken. Marilyn eased the SUV out of her driveway, the air conditioning already humming against the hint of salt riding inland on the breeze. Evelyn sat beside her, a wide-brimmed straw hat resting on her lap and a small cooler tucked at her feet. "Tybee Island," Evelyn said, buckling her seatbelt with a little flourish, because some victories deserve an ocean view. The highway unrolled in long, lazy ribbons, the SUV gliding over every seam and bump with the kind of composure Marilyn hadn't known in a car for years. The steering was light, the cabin quiet enough that their conversation floated easily above the muted hum of the tires. "This thing handles like it's reading your mind," Evelyn said as they passed a marsh where egrets stood motionless in the shallows. Marilyn smiled, adjusting her grip on the wheel. "Feels like it was built for me." They reached the island just before noon, the road narrowing until the smell of salt water and fried seafood announced the pier before it came into view. The gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp against the steady hush of waves curling onto the sand. They parked near the pier, the SUV tucking neatly into the spot as if it had been waiting for it all morning. Marilyn locked it with a gentle click, the sound lost in the chatter of beachgoers and the soft slap of flip-flops on weathered boards. Lunch was at a cafe perched at the edge of the pier, where the breeze carried just enough spray to salt their hair. They sat at a table with a view straight down the coastline, the horizon blurring into the pale sky. Evelyn ordered shrimp po' boys. Marilyn went for the grilled grouper, the flesh flaking under her fork like it had been caught an hour ago. Between bites, Evelyn chuckled, eyes sparkling. "Do you ever think about that night at Bible study? Him, holding court all puffed up?" Marilyn sipped her iced tea. "I think about it the way you think about a spark after the fire's already built." Evelyn laughed, nearly sending a fry across the table. "That's exactly it." After lunch, they strolled the pier, stopping at a little souvenir shop painted the color of sea glass. The air inside smelled of sunscreen and cedar shelves. Marilyn picked up a small paperweight shaped like a ship's wheel, its brass spokes catching the light. She turned it over in her palm, imagining it on Ray's desk, a quiet nod to the role he'd played. "This one," she said, tucking it into her basket. By the time they headed back, the sun had tilted west, painting the water in broad strokes of gold. The SUV's engine purred contentedly as they left the island, the bridge rising ahead of them like the crest of a wave. They didn't talk much on the drive home, and they didn't need to. The silence between them was full, not of things unsaid, but of things understood. Marilyn let the miles slide beneath them, the landscape shifting from marsh to oak-lined roads where shadows stretched long across the asphalt. Just outside Savannah, the sky deepened to the color of ripe peaches. The low sun flared in the SUV's side mirror, and for a moment, Marilyn saw herself as if from a distance. A woman steering her own way home, the road hers in every sense that mattered. When they pulled into her driveway, the porch light was just beginning to glow. Evelyn gathered her things, pausing before getting out. "You realize, don't you?" she said. "This isn't just about a truck anymore." Marilyn rested her hand on the wheel, the leather warm under her palm. "I know," she said. She watched Evelyn's sedan disappear down the street before cutting the engine. The house was quiet, the evening air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine. She carried the ship's wheel inside, set it on the table beside the phone, and glanced once toward the empty road outside. A thought flickered, cool, certain, and entirely her own. There's still more to be done. The next Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day when the neighborhood seemed to linger outside a little longer than necessary. Marilyn had just returned from the farmer's market, the pearl gray SUV parked neatly in her driveway, when Mrs. Harrell from across the street waved from her mailbox. "That's a fine-looking car you've got there," she called, shading her eyes with one hand. Marilyn smiled, closing the hatch with a gentle push. "Thank you. It suits me." A little later, Mr. Doyle from 2 houses down wandered past while walking his spaniel, stopping to admire the clean lines and shiny paint. "Looks brand new," he said. "You must have gotten a good deal." "It was worth every penny," Marilyn replied, and left it at that. By Sunday, word had made its way through the grapevine. The moment she stepped into the Baptist church's foyer, she felt the change. The quick flick of eyes toward her, the slight pause in conversation, the way whispers seemed to slip into the air like steam. David was by the coffee urn, stirring sugar into his cup with studied attention. When she passed, he shifted slightly, enough to keep his face angled away. She didn't mind. Sharon, on the other hand, made her feelings plain. As Marilyn took her seat in the fellowship hall, Sharon walked past without so much as a nod, her heels clicking a little too hard on the linoleum. The faint perfume she wore, something sharp and citrus, hung in the air long after she'd moved on. Evelyn arrived a few minutes later, sliding into the chair beside Marilyn. She wore the faintest of smiles, the kind that said she'd been watching the same undercurrents. When the pastor called everyone to order for Bible study, Evelyn reached over and gave Marilyn a quick, deliberate wink. The hour passed in the familiar rhythm of scripture readings and quiet discussion, the scent of coffee mingling with the musty hymnals stacked in the corner. But when the closing prayer ended, Ray appeared in the aisle, his leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "Mind if I walk you to your car?" he asked. They stepped out into the bright noon sun, the SUV gleaming like a well-kept secret in the lot. Ray glanced at it, then back at her. "Looks good on you," he said. Marilyn smiled. "It feels good on me." He paused at the curb, his tone shifting to something more deliberate. "Have you thought about updating your will?" She gave him a sidelong look. "That's a question with timing." "It's just situations change," he said, "and sometimes it's best to make sure your intentions are as clear on paper as they are in your mind." Marilyn didn't answer right away. She looked over the top of the SUV, across the lot where David stood with Sharon, both of them pretending not to notice her. She thought about the title in her desk drawer, the way the keys felt in her hand, the way her own name looked in bold print where his used to be. "I'll think about it," she said at last, her voice as even as the breeze ruffling the leaves overhead. Ray nodded once, as if that was all he needed for now, and headed toward his car. Marilyn unlocked the SUV and slid into the driver's seat, the cool air wrapping around her as she started the engine. In the rearview mirror, she caught a final glimpse of David looking her way before turning sharply back to Sharon. She eased out of the lot, the late morning sun flashing off the hood, and somewhere between the church and home, she decided thinking about it wasn't enough. It was time to decide. The following Thursday, the air was bright but brittle, the kind of spring morning that made even downtown Savannah feel like it had been freshly scrubbed. Marilyn Parallel parked the SUV outside Ray's office, the tires settling neatly against the curb. Inside, the reception area smelled faintly of lemon polish and the faintly metallic tang of a copier mid-run. The young woman at the desk looked up with a smile that was practiced but genuine. "Mr. Holloway's expecting you, Mrs. Tate." Ray's office was a sunlit rectangle with shelves lined in law books and framed photographs of local landmarks. A ficus tree stood by the window, leaves trembling slightly in the draft from the vent. Ray rose as she entered, offering a steady handshake in the chair opposite his desk. "You've decided," he said, not as a question. "I have," she replied, setting her handbag beside her and folding her cane neatly against the arm of the chair. He opened a manila folder, the top sheet already printed with her name. "Your current will names David as your primary beneficiary for all assets not otherwise designated. Do you still wish for that to stand?" "No." She didn't flinch, didn't pause. "Remove him entirely." Ray's pen hovered above the paper for a fraction of a second before moving again. "And instead, I want the bulk of my estate to go to the Savannah Literacy Foundation and the Children's Wing of Memorial Hospital," she said. "Those two first, then—" She allowed a small smile. "A portion for Evelyn Harper." Ray glanced up, one eyebrow lifting. "Personal gratitude?" "Personal loyalty," Marilyn corrected. "She's earned it." The pages shuffled under his hands, the sound crisp and decisive. He dictated small notes to himself. Percentages, account names, the property lot number for her house. When he slid the first set of documents toward her, the language was dense, but she read each line as if shelving books in perfect order. David's name no longer appeared except in the clause formally revoking his prior claim. The rest was clean, intentional. "You understand," Ray said quietly. "This will stand as your final directive unless you change it again." I understand. He turned the signature page toward her and offered his pen. It was heavier than it looked, the kind that made a mark with authority. Marilyn signed her name in steady strokes, the loop of the M curling like the flourish of a ribbon at the end of a gift. When the last page was done, Ray gathered the documents, tapped them into alignment, and placed them in the folder. I'll have these notarized and filed. You'll get your copy in a few days. Marilyn sat back, a long, measured breath leaving her lungs. Feels lighter, she said, like closing a door I should have shut a long time ago. Ray nodded. That's the point. Closure isn't about forgetting. It's about knowing you've said the last word. Outside, the sky had deepened to a richer blue, the kind that made the magnolia leaves shine. She walked to the SUV without hurry, the keys warm in her hand. Once inside, she rolled the windows down before starting the engine. The air was soft with the scent of wisteria drifting in from somewhere nearby, tangling in her hair as she eased into traffic. The city moved around her in fragments. A man unloading crates of shrimp at the riverfront, two women laughing outside a cafe, a boy balancing on curb with his arms spread like wings. She let the wind wash over her arms, the sun warm on her left cheek. At a red light, she caught her reflection in the side mirror. The set of her mouth was calm, but there was a steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there before the truck, before the title, before the day she decided her life's last page wouldn't be signed by anyone else. When she pulled into her driveway, the porch light clicked on automatically, though the sun was still high. She left the SUV idling for a moment, listening to the hum of the engine before shutting it off. In the quiet that followed, she thought about how news traveled in Savannah, how quickly David would hear. And then, almost idly, she wondered how he'd take it when he learned he'd been written out entirely. That thought lingered like the last chord of a hymn as she unlocked her front door. The idea came to Marilyn while she was rinsing strawberries at the kitchen sink, the early light slanting through the blinds. The old sedan, dependable, well-kept, and sitting idle now that she had the SUV, was taking up space in her garage. She didn't need it, but she knew someone who did. By Friday, she'd made a quiet arrangement with the church office. The recipient was a young mother named Carla, who'd been walking to the grocery store with her toddler balanced on one hip and a paper bag of diapers in the other. Marilyn had noticed her more than once slipping into Sunday service late, rain in her hair, shoulders hunched from the weight of the week. Saturday morning, Carla arrived in the church parking lot, not quite sure why the pastor had asked her to come. When Marilyn handed her the keys, the young woman froze, blinking down at the ring as if it might vanish if she moved too quickly. This is for me? It's yours, Marilyn said simply. Insurance is paid through the end of the year. Oil was changed last month. She'll get you where you need to go. Carla's face crumpled. She pressed her hands to her mouth, tears catching in the corners of her eyes. I don't even know how to thank you. You just did, Marilyn replied. The pastor, who'd stood quietly off to the side, laid a hand on Carla's shoulder and said a brief prayer of gratitude. The morning sun glinted off the sedan's polished hood, and for a moment Marilyn saw the reflection of all three of them, past, present, and a little piece of the future, shimmering together in the paint. Word spread faster than she expected. By Sunday morning, the sanctuary felt alive with that subtle, humming energy that came when the congregation shared a story between them. During announcements, the pastor set down his notes, looked out over the pews, and said, I want to take a moment to recognize an act of generosity that reminds us what it means to care for one another. Mrs. Marilyn Tate has given her own car to a member of our church in need. That's love in action. A low ripple of approval moved through the room, soft amens, nods, and a few polite claps. From her seat near the aisle, Marilyn kept her gaze on the pulpit, though she was aware of movement in the corner of her vision. David, 2 rows back, shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed firmly on the hymnal in his lap. Sharon, beside him, gave a single, slow blink and crossed her arms. Evelyn, sitting at Marilyn's side, reached over and patted her hand once. No show, no fanfare, just the weight of a friend who understood exactly what she'd done and why. The service went on, scripture flowing into sermon, hymn into benediction. But when they stood for the closing prayer, Marilyn felt that stillness she associated with something completed. A line written, a chapter closed. Outside, the air was bright and full of the scent of cut grass. Carla was there by the church steps, her little boy clutching a stuffed bear under one arm. "I drove us here this morning," she said, smiling through eyes still swollen from yesterday's tears. "It felt like freedom." Marilyn smiled back. "That's exactly what it is." The ride home was quiet, the SUV's cabin filled with the rhythmic whoosh of passing air through the open windows. Sunlight dappled the road through the overhanging oaks, each patch of light warming her arm where it rested against the door. As she turned onto her own street, she passed the Harrells weeding their front bed. Mrs. Harrell straightened, gave a cheerful wave, and called, "Saw what you did, Marilyn! You've set the bar high for the rest of us!" Marilyn lifted her hand in return but didn't slow. Contentment, she'd learned, didn't require lingering. She pulled into her driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the cooling hush. Through the windshield, the world looked framed and still, her geraniums nodding in the breeze, the porch light switched off in the daylight. And beneath the ease in her chest was the quiet knowledge that David would hear about the donation, that he would recognize it for what it was, something he could neither undo nor outshine. She reached for her cane, feeling the steady weight of the keys in her purse. Victory didn't always roar. Sometimes it rode home with the windows down. The sky over Savannah was a soft, untroubled blue when Marilyn eased the SUV out of her driveway. The morning air was cool for spring, tinged with salt drifting inland, and the sunlight lay in gentle stripes across the road. She didn't call Evelyn this time, didn't tell anyone her plan. Some drives belonged only to the person behind the wheel. The highway to Tybee unfolded in long, familiar stretches, bordered by marsh grass that shimmered gold in the light. She kept the windows half down, letting the breeze thread through her hair and carry the briny scent of low tide. The SUV hummed beneath her, each shift of the gears so smooth she felt more like she was gliding than driving. By the time she crossed the bridge onto the island, the gulls were already circling, their cries sharp and bright over the whisper of waves. She parked in her usual spot near the pier, the SUV sliding in as neatly as if it had been waiting for her. Locking it with a light touch, she walked toward the line of weathered shops and cafes, her cane tapping lightly on the boards. The seafood shack at the end of the pier was already half full. She ordered her favorite, fried shrimp basket with hush puppies and coleslaw, and took it to a small table by the railing where she could see the water stretching out in a broad, unbroken sheet. The shrimp were hot and perfectly crisp, the kind that leave a faint trace of salt on your fingertips, no matter how many napkins you use. She ate slowly, letting her gaze wander from the horizon to the beach below, where children chased the edge of the waves and darted back, squealing when the foam caught their ankles. The breeze lifted the edges of the paper tray, rustling it like a page turning. After lunch, she wandered into the bookstore just off the pier, the one that smelled of coffee and sun-warmed paper. She ran her hand along the spines until she found a worn hardcover mystery, the kind with a cover illustration so dated it felt timeless. Carrying it to the sand, she settled into a weathered bench that looked out over the ocean. The pages turned easily, but her mind drifted. She thought of that Bible study night, the offhand cruelty of David's words, the ripple of awkward chuckles, Evelyn's steady presence at her side. From that moment, the path had been laid, the lien search, the bank visit, the title in her name, the SUV in her drive, the will rewritten, the sedan passed on to someone who would truly need it. One event had tipped into the next, like dominoes falling not by accident, but by her own deliberate hand. And now here she was, no audience, no one to witness or applaud, simply herself, by the water, in a life that finally felt like hers to steer. The sun was lowering when she returned to the SUV, the metal warm under her palm as she opened the door. The drive home was unhurried, the road dappled with the long shadows of the oaks arching overhead. She kept the windows down, the wind filling the cabin with the smell of salt and wildflowers blooming along the roadside. Somewhere between the island bridge and the city limits, she glanced in the rearview mirror and caught her own eyes. Steady, certain, the kind of look a person wears when they've made every choice they meant to make. When she turned onto her own street, the day's light was softening to gold, the air thick with the scent of jasmine drifting from her porch. She pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, the sudden quiet settling around her like a final punctuation mark. Her hand lingered on the steering wheel, the leather warm and familiar. She thought of the truck, the title, the conversations that had once tightened her chest. And then she thought of now, of the cool certainty running through her like a steady current. Some vehicles run on gas, mine runs on principle.